The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Tēnā koutou katoa, this has gone by lunchtime. It's June the 26th, 2024. Morena, Annabelle Lee-Mather.
Morena.
Morena, Ben Thomas.
Morena.
What is on the agenda this morning? I know that's what you're wondering. Well, the news is good. We're going to talk about cancer drugs. We're going to talk about infrastructure. You'll be pleased to know that we have with us today Annabelle and Ben, who are both experts in large marine vessels and transmission hardware for electricity. We're also going to talk a bit about Scrutiny Week, maybe. But yeah, let's get into it. The announcement came in the post-cabinet press conference on Monday after 25 days. It was 25 days after the budget. And the announcement is that $600 million will cover 4 years for, quote, up to 54 new medicines, including 26 cancer treatments. It had been a big problem for the government. They obviously moved very quickly to try and find a way to square the circle and provide most of these cancer drugs or replacements rather than the ones they'd listed, because it turns out that the best idea when you're using an agency such as Pharmac is not to list in public the drugs that you'd like to have. And also some of them have been overtaken. Chris Jackson, the Otago oncologist, called it a great outcome from a terrible process. Is that how you see it, Annabelle?
100%. I think that sums it up perfectly. I mean, it is an excellent result for those who have been lobbying, for more treatments, but it's been an absolutely harrowing process for cancer sufferers and their loved ones. It's remarkable to see the amount of money that's been invested in this. And by remarkable, I mean wonderful, but also curious, because it makes you wonder, why we didn't do this earlier. And I think, that the next part of the question is how is this implemented? Because, for those who are taking these treatments orally, it's pretty straightforward. But, if you've ever hung out in a chemo ward, a lot of mahi goes into getting those treatments into people. So it'll be interesting to see how the rollout goes. From a Māori perspective, I'm really interested to see how these medicines are rolled out through an equity lens, because, for example, on the hui, we've done stories before about Māori who need access to Keytruda because they're suffering from lung cancer, but Pharmac doesn't provide it for people who have lung cancer. They only provide it for people who have skin cancer, but Māori, by and large, it's very, very rare for Māori to get skin cancer. So how do you ensure that these medicines are going to be equitably distributed across those people who are most in need? And I guess, whatever else happens in Luxon's time as Prime Minister, I think that this could be a legacy moment that he can be proud of in years to come.
Ben, what's your view of this?
It's the government delivering on its promise. It said at budget time when there was a hue and cry about the omission of the new funding for I think at the time, 13 cancer drugs. They said, look, don't worry, this is something we always intended to do. We'll have an announcement before Christmas, by which they meant in 3 weeks' time. And, which I think indicates the sort of political panic that was created by the backlash. The sticking points that probably pushed it out to 21 days or so, or 23 days, was no, it was even less. Seems to have been, this, as Luxon was talking about procurement, there's some indication that maybe David Seymour and ACT kind of dug in and said, we don't want to undermine Pharmac by having alternative sort of distribution of those funds. And that meant that, the only way to get a large chunk of those cancer drugs was to basically go to Pharmac and say, what position on the list is the lowest one of these cancer drugs? How much money do we need, do you think, to get all of the drugs up to that point on the priority list? And so what it's meant is, an even bigger increase in the Pharmac funding from the, what was a record increase, although they said only enough to keep the lights on at the budget. So, well played by Seymour if that is the case. Well played by the cancer advocacy groups. And, I think the government obviously had to do this, politically, but really does bring into sharp relief just how tough it is going to be to meet those fiscal allowances that the finance minister and the prime minister gave themselves at budget time, saying, we'll allow $2.4 billion spending next year. Well, $150 million of that is already gone on this cancer promise. You're down to $2.25 billion when Treasury has already suggested that, the fiscal pressures, just inflation and population growth, will be about $2.5 billion. So really, really turns the focus on the fiscal discipline from here on as well.
It's interesting because it's obviously also a great win for Dr. Shane Reti. And it also means that a whole lot of drugs that weren't on that list that the government, first outlined now have been funded because, as you said, Ben, you've got to go, Pharmac has its list, it can't frog leap over different drugs to get to the ones the government wants. So a whole lot of other illnesses are also going to get access to treatments that they otherwise wouldn't have got access to before. But again, the litmus test will be that these drugs don't end up sitting around in cabinets somewhere, and that the infrastructure is there to get them into the patients. And that's going to be tricky because, as we know, our health system is already stretched. So how do we make sure that there's the doctors and the nurses and all of that to actually administer?
And so the sanctity of the Pharmac model is preserved. The cost of it is being booked against next year's budget, and that is, as you say, Ben, shows just how tight the belt is going forward. But this is kind of afterpay, isn't it, really? This is the risk of when things pop up that need to find political solutions, that there is only a limited pool of future money that you can draw on.
Yeah, that's right. And, one of Nicola Willis's most effective attacks on Grant Robertson was he never kept to his own fiscal operating allowance. He would say, well, next year the discipline starts, and then he would always, he would consistently exceed it. Now, there's two major reasons why that happens. First of all, you just, political expediency takes over. You see a problem and you think the best way to solve this politically for me is to throw money at it, to make it go away. The second and related issue is that, things come up. Events come up that need money. And the way New Zealand finance ministers have tended to regard this is probably to beat a dead horse, is kind of the way that I tend to treat my paychecks, which is, look, I'll just spend up large the first week, and then in that 1 week before my next pay period, I'll live off 2-minute noodles. And, but it doesn't take into account if, something breaks on your car or if you really want to go out that week. And, I think there has been a bit of a lack of realism from our finance ministers about that, for a while now.
Anything in the poll that emerged on Monday night, a rare thing these days? We had a One News Varian poll, and in a way it was a kind of useful, sobering reminder that, some of us get very excited about the daily ins and outs and ups and downs, and there's been various speculation about one-term government, all of that, which is, whether there's anything in that, it's obviously pretty premature. National has gone up a couple of points, and so the cancer drug brouhaha may have damaged them a bit, but maybe the tax cuts pulled them up by whatever they dropped. Otherwise, it's pretty much business as usual. A couple of points up for New Zealand First, who move above the threshold in the survey. Labour down 1, the Greens down 1. So the Greens obviously haven't had enough scandals in the last polling period to push them back up. Anything in the poll that sticks out to people?
I was surprised that the cancer treatment situation hadn't impacted in the polls, but I guess when you think about it, this is about where you would expect a new coalition government to sit. Like, really, it was the last poll that was a bit of an anomaly. You wouldn't expect so early in the piece for them to be polling so low. I did think it was telling, though, that none of the coalition leaders seemed to be warmly embraced by the public. Not cracking numbers here for Luxon, for Peters or Seymour, and the movements that we have seen tracking upwards are pretty small. So I guess in some ways the surprise is that it's not really that much of a surprise.
Yeah, I think it puts the last poll into context that, perhaps, Mikey Sherman is a great political reporter, and I wouldn't want to join the weird pylon on her after, the last TV1 poll, but it does sort of suggest that maybe there was a little bit too much excitability about one poll and one-term governments and all if an election were held tomorrow. Because, what we're seeing and what we've seen since the election is really bouncing around the mean from that election night result. I actually, if there was anything to take from it, I think it was probably the second poll result that said around about that I've seen that said about a quarter of people, thought the tax cuts were good, quarter of them sort of thought they were bad, and about half sort of didn't really have much of an opinion either way. You start to wonder whether that's as a political day trader, whether that's a good investment of $17 billion. But obviously, honouring the promise, keeping faithful to the base, I guess was what they really valued there. I think, in terms of what Annabelle was saying, I think National might take a bit of heart that Seymour and Peters have dropped back in the preferred Prime Minister. Obviously getting clear air from those two has been a big problem for Luxon so far during his Prime Ministership. It has been difficult for him to sort of stamp his authority. His numbers are still not great in the low 20s, but, much more clear air between he and his deputy and putative deputy. Beyond that, really not a lot that you can tell from sort of, laying out the organs of that poll on a stone altar. It doesn't really tell us too much.
Meanwhile, up and down the country, a lot of things seem to be not really working. We had the ferry grounding, which was very quickly on Friday night, wasn't it? It was sort of some time after 9 p.m. There was a lot of concern, and then it grounded in Bob's Bay, I think it was, in sand and mud, thanks to Bob and to the bay, and then it became a meme within very short order, which is great, and it was quite funny, but I think it's quite easy to overlook how close that was to being a very, very serious disaster when you lose your steering and you float into a piece of land. You're very lucky if that piece of land is sandy rather than rocky. Meanwhile, up north, we've got a power pylon falling over, it turns out literally owing to a lack of nuts, that some nuts had been undone, that attaching the power pylon to the ground, and 100,000 people lost power for quite a long period of time. Most importantly of all, the Prime Minister's plane was grounded once again. And it makes me wonder, Annabelle, I mean, let's not use this nonsense nomenclature of third world country because that's ridiculous on a number of levels. But to borrow a Luxonism, are we a C-list country? Is that what we are? I mean...
Well, speaking of the C-list and C words, like if you can't bring the baubles of colonisation to Aotearoa, like you might as well quit. Because, like, First Nations people, they get the Statue of Liberty and Disneyland and Chuck E. Cheese, and, you know, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders, they get Luna Park and Kylie Minogue. What do we get? We got defunct Footrot Flats and Lion Safari Park, and they both fell over too. Like, all I can say as someone who uses hair straighteners on a daily basis, I'm deeply concerned about the state of our infrastructure. And, you know, as Māori, we spend a lot of time thinking about our sovereignty. And frankly, I think our treaty partners should too, because you could make it the argument that New Zealand is becoming a failed state, you know. Our infrastructure is failing, our power, our roading, our, you know, ability to literally move our stuff from one island to the other, everything.
It was clearly an error not to include as one of the treaty principles when drafted, make sure that there are nuts on the bolts.
Yes.
That's one commitment. And don't do up the wiring with some tape that you found on a shelf, per the story by Georgina Campbell in the New Zealand Herald on the Aotearoa and its plight.
Waka are very important. If you can't keep your waka on the sea, hoki atu.
Yeah. Ben, your analysis of the ferry situation and more broadly.
Look, I don't like to really talk about the ferry situation because it gets perilously close to being sort of like train nerd shit. I think that people have strong opinions about ferries, not people that I like to talk to. I don't know what IREX is. I don't intend to learn. I think putting aside the obvious headlines, you know, like any psychopathic short man outside a pub knows, you know, if you take out the nuts, everyone's the same height. But although these. It is interesting because I think, you know, the nuts were actually an example of too much maintenance. You know, they were taking them off and cleaning them individually or whatever. But and actually, you know, a large amount of our infrastructure deficit is because of poor maintenance, as the Infrastructure Commission pointed out. And, you know, as we've seen from, you know, the various water catastrophes happening around the country, in particular Wellington, you know, none of these are really key issues about New Zealand's sort of infrastructure, but they are sort of, you know, poetic truths, I guess, about the way in which we sort of maintain services and essential sort of plant. And, you know, look, those problems are well known. We've known about the, you know, $200 billion at least sort of maintenance and infrastructure bill that's coming down the quote unquote pipeline. You know, there's, you know, for many years, the only work that's been done on any pipeline is fucking drawing up the infrastructure pipeline. And, you know, look, I think there are promising signs there. Chris Bishop appeared at Scrutiny Week, which I think we're going to get onto a bit later, and also gave his magnum opus speech to his cabinet paper about you know, different ways of funding infrastructure, which, you know, he admitted the government is not going to be able to pay for all of it. They are going to have to turn to the private sector. They'll probably have to turn to foreign direct investment, and you know, if we can inject a bit of reality into it, rather than just sort of big promises that end up being unfunded, which both parties have been guilty of, both major parties.
Yes.
And if we can get some kind of consensus on the major projects so that we don't just keep swinging the pendulum back and forth from uncompleted project to uncompleted project every sort of 6 to 9 years.
The thing with the Aratere is that I think a lot of New Zealanders now have no memory of the Wahine disaster, and there's sort of a hubris in our generation, a bit like when it comes to to being able to vaccinate against horrible diseases that wiped out our grandparents, generation and their parents and grandparents that, we get to be blissfully unaware of. But, Te Moana o Raukawa, that Cook Strait, it's such a treacherous piece of water, and the Aratere could be a portent of things to come if we don't seriously misunderstand, how important it is to have safe vessels to get across that body of water. And we talk about the lifespan of those ships, but the reality is they're not supposed to work out their entire lifespan as the main kind of workhorses of that crossing. The idea is that, as they get towards the end of their life, that they're kind of backup vessels, not the main show in town. So I really hope that the Aratere is, a bit of a wake-up call, not just for politicians, but for all of Aotearoa about, how important it is for us to have vessels that, can operate safely across the Cook Strait, because people's lives literally hang in the balance. And also, the potential for an environmental disaster is really high too.
I think one of the things that has been talked about sort of on the down low for quite a long time is, iwi co-investment in infrastructure. In terms of the Cook Strait crossing, it seems like a natural thing for Ngāti Toa to get into. They didn't have many problems back in the pre-settlement days. The pre-treaty signing days. Michael Cullen used to describe it as a maritime empire. Just something for for Ngāti Toa to look at.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, senior writer at The Spinoff. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Hey, just quickly on the C list thing, became a sort of 48-hour wonder in a way, but this was in an interview that Christopher Luxon gave to News Talk ZB before departing on the trip to Japan. He made similar statements to Janeta Racy for the Herald, in which he described previous people who had gone on Prime Minister's trade delegation trips as C-listers and tag-alongs. Is that just a triviality, a kind of passing story headline, or does it speak to a bigger issue that the Prime Minister has in terms of struggling with some of his use of idioms, Annabelle, including it'd be when he was in the UK describing New Zealand businesses going soft, and of course the famous adage that we like to invoke from time to time on this podcast, wet, whiny and inward looking and all that sort of stuff. Is it a big deal or should we just get over it and stop being precious?
I think it kind of is a big deal because it speaks to his failure to understand the tikanga of being a politician on the international stage. You don't go out and slag off your country. You don't TS, businesses that have accompanied former politicians on these sorts of hiding before. I listened to Tim Murphy the other day and he said actually the tag-alongs and the C-listers
that go on these trade missions are actually the politicians. The businesses are there to actually do the business, and the politicians get to stand, in their reflected glory and be seen signing pieces of paper, but they're actually the unnecessary appendage, not the other way around. So, yeah, I think, again, it just speaks to him trying to, misunderstanding that there's he tikanga tō te ao pakihi, he tikanga anō tō te ao tōrangapū. There's a difference between the corporate world and the kind of competitive smack talk that you indulge in that realm, and the political world as it engages, in business and trade and all of those sorts of things. But it is something that he needs to tidy up on because it distracts from the kaupapa.
And the other part of it, I think, that's important is that the true A-listers, if you will, that is, if you're talking about Fonterra or Rocket Lab, per Tim Murphy's point, you're right, they're tag-alongs. The ones that really matter are the sort of companies that are on the brink of something, as John Key would have said, the brink of something special, that just need that extra bit of kind of star power, a bit of leverage to push them over the line. I remember one company CEO telling me that when they were on a trip to the US, that it made all the difference that Jacinda Ardern was able to literally bring together them with somebody who was important, who was a potential investor. And, these are the people who are at in that space, Ben, where they just need the extra tip over are more important than the Fonterras or the Fletchers or the Rocket Labs.
Yeah, look, I think that's true, and Peter Jackson's old offsider, Ian Taylor, wrote a quite scathing piece in the Herald on that, and we've already heard reports that in previous trade delegations, business leaders have actually asked the Prime Minister, can you stop saying New Zealand is open for business now? New Zealand has never been closed for business except for a very brief time during COVID. And sort of trying to compare the previous government, which was in international terms exactly the same as the current government, as far as trade is concerned, as if there's been some sort of glasnost or something subsequently, isn't helpful. New Zealand shouldn't be portrayed as a banana republic, at any point, apart from at international navigation conferences. And I think part of the other issue is that I think it is good that Luxon has always had a focus on trade. It was one of the first big things he talked about in his economic speeches when he became leader. He really does see addressing that balance of payments, which is a drag on New Zealand, as a priority. He's a business guy. He's in sales. His background is marketing. He likes making deals, selling things, and whether you believe in The Secret as per Oprah, or whether you just believe that where you put your attention is important, having a Prime Minister who is focused on trade will be helpful for New Zealand trade. It will mean that line calls about, regulation or whatever will tend to tip in the balance of trade. That said, there is a certain naivety in that he seems to think that even if Jacinda Ardern was not particularly prioritised on trade, that no one in government has ever thought about this before, as if MFAT and Trade and Enterprise and, have just been totally, have just been thinking about, just been sitting in their offices replaying the David Longy nuclear-free debate, on loop every day, or working full-time on the Christchurch call, as opposed to trying to get free trade agreements and promote New Zealand businesses. There is nothing new about taking high-level business people overseas. There is nothing new about talking up New Zealand. There is nothing new about, as he said, having lunch with high-powered investors. And I think it just betrays that sort of just the gaps in his knowledge. He sometimes thinks that literally no one across all of the state has ever considered this stuff before, and it can lead to him looking a little foolish, like in this case.
I think, particularly given that Ardern actually led quite a number of successful trade missions and was a bit of a darling on the international stage, it kind of looks like little bit sour.
Now, last week at Parliament wasn't the sitting week per se, but it was a gathering week. It was like the Glastonbury of Parliament, where they had many select committees meeting for scrutiny week, and the ministers of the Crown were exhorted to be present rather than to be doing other business around the country. There was they and some senior officials were available for interrogation by MPs. It was the most kind of robust and various exchange of views since the Freedom Village on the front lawn. It was like that, but inside. By newsroom's count, there were nearly 100 hours of hearings. Seems like, I've only consumed this, I have to confess, secondhand. I've read things and heard things about it. I didn't attend any of it. But it seems like a positive development, Ben Thomas, to have some mechanisms other than question time in the House, other than media conferences where ministers can be held to account. It seems like some of it was a bit showboaty rather than necessarily getting into the weeds, because the advantage of this is you can have a sustained line of questioning, trying to get into some detail, but it will develop over time, I'm sure. What did you make of it?
Really positive development. Agreed with the Business Committee last year, so all the parties across Parliament. I think Hayden Donnell, friend of the spin-off, tweeted along with a bunch of the headlines that had come out last week, National may be rethinking its commitment to Scrutiny Week now. But I think it was a really good, it was a very good exercise because, first of all, I think that some of the things that made headlines were actually pretty good things to get out there. We'll talk about Tamapotaka, presumably. But also, it wasn't just, people trying to recreate the inquiry scene from The Thick of It or Veep or Succession, the same one that's been used by the writers all the way through. And it wasn't sort of, the theatrics of a US congressional hearing, but it was, I think, largely informative. I think David Seymour's appearance to talk about his new regulatory ministry with Grania Moss was actually really informative, both in talking about sort of his philosophy, but also, the actual nuts and bolts of how that new ministry will work. And I think that would have been informative for, the opposition MPs who were there, anyone in the public who was interested. And I think it sort of showed its value. Then there were things like, Tamapotaka, the headline there was, he said, well, maybe there has to be a cost-benefit analysis. We can't save all of the endangered species. That's a statement of fact, right? It's the sort of thing that you don't...
It's a truism, but a weird thing to lead out with.
First of all, you've got to put the Black Robins on notice that they need to prepare a cost-benefit analysis. Second of all, you need to, if you're going to be doing cost benefits, you need to take into account the enduring psychic pain that Shane Jones feels the longer carnivorous snails exist. But more broadly, it is good to get that out in the open and say, look, this is actually a matter of cost. There will be fungi and algae and probably things we haven't discovered yet that we can afford to save, and we need to think very hard about prioritization.
Annabelle.
Anytime there's more scrutiny, it's got to be a good thing. I personally did not have time to scrutinise Scrutiny Week, although I did visit Parliament last week. But I've caught up on some of the articles. Glenn McConnell, if you want a quick Scrutiny Week 101, has done a very good one where he talks about, the SFO turning up and essentially not getting questioned at all, which is a bit of a shame. In terms of Tamapotaka's statements, I think that there's a lot of New Zealanders who don't accept as a fait accompli that we are going to lose species, or that it's somehow okay or a given, when we do have the means, the technology, the know-how, and actually we do have the resources, but it's a matter of prioritisation, what we value versus what we don't. And I think, I know that Tama is someone who cares about the environment, so, it's surprising to hear about him to hear him speaking in that manner, from a te ao Māori perspective, not that there is one single perspective, but, our manu, our taiao, has informed and shaped our culture. So many of our proverbs, our saying, our words come directly from our taiao, from our manu, to think that, soon we're going to be literally crossing whakatauki out of the book because those manu no longer exist, because generations won't be able to grasp the true meaning of those whakatauki because those manu have gone, is, a really sad thing to consider.
One bouquet, I think, to James Meagher, who's the relatively new National MP, gave a very impressive maiden speech and is chairing the Justice Select Committee, and by all accounts did a very good job there, and spoke very well, I thought, on RNZ's In the House show, talking about the importance of Scrutiny Week and, the importance to, even though it might not be comfortable for the government all the time, how it's an important part of the probity and accountability for Parliament. So he seems like a real prospect. He seems like someone who's got a very interesting and intelligent and rounded view of Aotearoa of parliamentary politics.
Yeah, James Meagher, he's been mucked as a star from day one. From his maiden speech, a few of us sort of, had him kind of mucked down earlier than that. He's very, very capable, really understands the importance of the institutions. He's an example of a former parliamentary staffer or ministerial staffer who is, a superb MP as a result of, partially as a result of that background, but also a lawyer, Ngāi Tahu, and great future ahead of him, and also really good to see that kind of bipartisan spirit, sort of as the chair of a committee, admittedly from a government party, saying actually, we do need to, thresh out these issues. That's what this is for. It's not just to provide cover for government ministers.
Well, that's us for today. A shout out quickly to acknowledge Marama Davidson, who gave a press conference last week to announce she has breast cancer and is going to be taking some time off. So we send all of our aroha and best to her. Oh, I should have mentioned at the top that the good news is we're at last doing a live podcast in Wellington. The bad news is it sold out within 2 days. So once again, you'll need to go and pull out your Bitcoin and go to the dark web if you want to try and procure any of those hen's teeth. But for those of you that did get tickets, we look forward to seeing you. It should be fun. I think that's us.
Do you have a podcast you want to promote?
Oh, yes. I have. There's another podcast called Juggernaut, which is the story of the fourth Labour government. A lot of people seem to be enjoying it so far. Who knows if that'll last? Probably not. But the third episode, which is all about ANZUS and nukes and Rainbow Warrior and all that, is out on Thursday morning.
Excitables.
And it's got some very entertaining.
I'm enjoying it a great deal. It's a thrilling ride.
Oh.
It is absolutely fantastic.
Well, good. Enjoy. Look out for Richard Armitage. He's a lot of fun. Just listening to the way he intonates on Thursdays. Cool. Thanks for hanging in with us. Talk soon.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the pōtiki of the taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirehama, the Kōpapa Korangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komatu o Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spin-Off Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.